The history of American and indeed British influence, meddling in Iran, goes back a long way, but why not start in 1979? You mentioned it there. Protests on the streets in Iran demanding change, the departure of the Shah. He does eventually go, and various groups are out on the streets, leftist groups, secularists, but also religious groups, and who should return from exile here in Paris, in fact. But the Ayatollah Khomeini, a few months later, the Islamic Republic is founded, and it's promised to spread its values and influence. A headache for the Americans ever since. It wasn't long before that anti-American sentiment manifested itself. You were talking about it just there, the first major incident in 1979 after the revolution, the hostage crisis. 50 or so US embassy employees and civilians held hostage after protesters stormed the embassy in Tehran, and it wasn't until nearly a year and a half later, early 1981, that the final hostages were released.
And of course, those tensions and conflicts continuing right throughout the 1980s.
1980s, yeah, the background there, the context is an increasingly bloody war between Iran and its neighbour Iraq, vying for influence in the region. Iran has been subject to a US arms embargo since the Islamic Revolution. You can see him there, Ronald Reagan. That's the background to one of the biggest scandals of his presidency, Irangate, the Iran-Contra scandal. The Americans apparently channeling arms to Iran. The official explanation being that all of this would be part of a deal to get hostages held in Lebanon by Iran's proxy Hezbollah, US hostages released. But of course, that scandal centering on the fact that the funds seem to have ended up in another part of the world that has been an obsession of America over the years, Central and Latin America, with Nicaragua's Contras. The war wages on, it gets ever more bloody. The US-Iran kind of tit for tat continuing in 1988. The US brings down Iran Air Flight 655, the best part of 300 people, most of them pilgrims killed there. The Americans saying they believed it was a military aircraft.
And jumping ahead a bit, we're talking there about Ronald Reagan, but things definitely didn't improve under George Bush.
They didn't. No, let's fast forward a little bit now. Another Republican president in the White House, George W. Bush. This is a time, of course, when the US has just been attacked. The 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington. We're in the run-up to what would become the Iraq War. There were all kinds of claims being made, a lot of rhetoric going around. And of course, the most infamous one was George W. Bush lumping Iran in this so-called axis of evil, making claims at the time which were the source of scepticism about Iran's alleged link to that kind of terrorism, to its pursuit of what he called weapons of mass destruction. But it nevertheless ushers in an era in which Iran's nuclear program, Western fears over it, increasingly become the focus of attention.
And moving then, Chris, from a Republican president in the United States to a Democrat, how did things develop under Barack Obama?
That's right, another change at the top. Barack Obama comes into the White House. One of the main features of his foreign policy was a plan to reset relations with Iran. There's that historic phone call with Rouhani back in 2013, and there, these images here, you can see the signing eventually of that nuclear accord in 2015 after protracted negotiations involving the Europeans. Barack Obama regarding that as one of the major success stories of his presidency. But we've been talking about changes at the top in the US. Who should come next, of course, but Donald Trump, a man intent on rolling back various Obama-era policies, pulling out of the nuclear accords, of course, much to the chagrin of some of his European allies, and that's where we are today. He pulls out those old tensions, those old tit-for-tat incidents in Iraq, in the Gulf. They start up again. The Iranians, even now, not fully pulling out of the accord, but it's in a pretty moribund state. They're pulling back from it further and further in the wake of Soleimani's killing. And that's where we are now in terms of European concerns, at least in terms of what can be salvaged going forward.